She's just the help. She's invisible. You have no idea what she's carrying. Zaraya didn't flinch when the gunman burst into the gold-leafed office in the heart of Seoul. She flinched when the man in the sleek black suit, the man she was supposed to just clean for, leaned in and whispered the one sentence that bound her fate to his. She knew the air had shifted the moment she stepped out of the shadows, her hand resting protectively on her belly, to stop the most dangerous man in Korea in his tracks. But it wasn't until they were trapped together in a private hotel suite, with the city's glittering skyline reflecting the cold steel in his hand, that the truth cracked open. He wasn't just a boss. He wasn't just disciplined and controlled. And when Park Tae-sung stepped toward her, his intense eyes locking onto her steady gaze, not with dismissal, but with a calculated territorial hunger, she finally understood. She hadn't just saved his life. She had been claimed by the Mafia for something far more terrifying than a job. Welcome to Afrokoreanstoryspace, besties. Today's story is for everyone who loves a strong, resolute heroine and a dangerous man who finally meets his match. Say hi in the comments if you are watching from Seoul, the US, or anywhere across the globe. To my returning besties, if you stop in the middle of this story, you will have dreams wondering how Zaraya protects her child from the underground. Drop a comment right now if you are already excited to see how a pregnant maid stopped the Korean Mafia cold. The golden halls of the Park estate were silent, a vacuum of wealth where even the dust seemed to know its place. Zaraya moved through the corridors with the rhythmic, practiced grace of someone who had learned to become part of the architecture. To the men in dark suits who guarded the mahogany doors, she was merely a shadow in a navy blue uniform, a composed figure whose only purpose was to ensure the crystal remained smudgeless and the tea remained hot. They never looked at her eyes, which were always steady and serious, and they certainly never looked at the slight curve of her belly where she kept her hand resting in a silent, protective vigil. Being invisible was Zaraya's greatest strength in Seoul. It was how a girl from a different world could navigate this secretive labyrinth of the Korean underground without being swallowed whole. She took pride in her professionalism. Her hair pulled back into a bun so tight it felt like a mask of discipline. Every morning, she polished the heavy oak desk of Park Tae-sung, a man whose wealth and authority felt like a physical weight in the room. She would catch glimpses of him, a tall, sharply built silhouette against the window, his swept-back undercut never out of place, his intense expression locked on a world of quiet dominance that she was never meant to understand. To Tae-sung, she was part of the service, a ghost who replenished his water and smoothed his sheets. He never noticed the emotional weight she carried or the way her resolve hardened every time he walked past her without a word. But Zaraya noticed everything. She noticed the subtle tattoo on the side of his neck that hinted at a dangerous past. She noticed the way the air grew cold when his phone rang, and the disciplined way he moved like a predator who had forgotten how to rest. Her life was a delicate balance of vulnerability and responsibility. By day, she scrubbed the floors of a gilded cage, and by night, she returned to her small apartment to dream of a future for her child that didn't involve the smell of expensive cologne and the calculated silence of the Mafia. She told herself she was safe as long as she stayed in the shadows. She believed that as long as she remained the invisible maid, the dangerous people her employer dealt with would never see her as anything more than a fixture of the house. She didn't realize that in Park Tae-sung's world, there is no such thing as a witness who doesn't eventually become a participant. The silence of the Park estate usually felt like a shield, but tonight it felt like a shroud. Zaraya moved through the darkened library, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs. She was supposed to be finishing her shift, her professionalism, pushing her to ensure every book was aligned before the Mafia boss returned. Her hand rested protectively on her belly, a silent promise to her child that they were almost done for the night. The heavy mahogany doors at the far end of the room creaked open, and Zaraya froze. The quiet dominance of Park Tae-sung entered the room, but he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by two men whose voices carried the jagged edge of dangerous people. Zaraya slipped behind a tall velvet curtain, her breath catching despite her fear as she pressed herself into the shadows. The shipment arrives at Incheon at midnight. A voice rasped, cold and calculated. Kim Taewon has already cleared the docks. It's a guaranteed exchange. Zariah's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew that name. Kim Taewon, a man ruthless and violent, a name whispered in the underground business circles as a synonym for death. Tae-sung, the investors are restless. Another voice added, low and dangerous. If the illegal trading scheme fails, there won't be enough money to cover the debt. Your empire will burn with everyone inside. From her hiding spot, Zariah could see the intense and controlled profile of Tae-sung through a gap in the fabric. He stood by the window, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the glittering skyline of Seoul. He looked like a predator in repose, but Zariah saw the strength rather than age in his posture begin to stiffen. The deal is set, Tae-sung replied, his deep voice carrying a tone of emotional restraint that sent ice through her veins. But as the other men spoke, Zariah's steady gaze widened in terror. They weren't discussing a deal. They were discussing a trap. They spoke of a calculated ambush at the docks, a solution that ended with Tae-sung's elimination. They were walking him into a lethal ambush disguised as a business deal. Zariah clutched her stomach, the unspoken tension in the room becoming unbearable. She was just a maid, a woman trapped in a gilded cage, who was never supposed to hear these whispers in the dark. If she stayed silent, the man who provided her protection would be dead by morning. If she spoke, she would be claiming a seat at a table where the only currency was blood. The clock on the library wall ticked with a precision that felt like a countdown. Zariah remained pressed against the velvet curtains, her professionalism replaced by a raw, vulnerable instinct for survival. Through the narrow gap in the fabric, she watched the two men exit, leaving Park Tae-sung alone in the calculated silence of the room. He reached for his tailored black suit jacket, his movements disciplined and intense, unaware that he was stepping toward his own elimination. Zariah knew she should stay hidden. She was a maid with a child to protect, a stranger in a foreign country, who had no business interfering in the dangerous games of the Korean Mafia. But as Tae-sung turned toward the door with a quiet dominance, the emotional weight of what she had heard became too heavy to carry. If he died, the gilded cage that kept her safe would shatter, leaving her and her unborn baby at the mercy of men like Kim Taewon. She stepped out from behind the curtain, her steady gaze meeting him for the first time. Tae-sung stopped cold, his piercing eyes narrowing as he realized his invisible servant had been watching him. The unspoken tension in the room was like a physical wire stretched to the breaking point. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his deep voice carrying a slight Korean accent that vibrated with authority. Zariah didn't flinch. She placed one hand protectively on her belly and took a step forward, closing the distance until she could smell his expensive cologne. Her resolve was a shield as she delivered the warning that would change both of their lives. "The docks at midnight," she whispered, her voice serious and composed. "It isn't a trade. It's an ambush. Deal gone wrong. Exit now." Tae-sung's hardened expression didn't shift, but something flickered in his eyes. A moment of amusement perhaps, or approval, that she would dare to speak to him this way. He looked at her dark fingers trembling against her navy blue uniform and then back to her brown eyes, searching for the liar. "Why tell me?" he asked, his predatory grace bringing him inches from her. "Because I'm not the only one in this room who wants to survive," she replied, her steady gaze never wavering. In that moment, the professionalism of the maid and the dominance of the boss merged into a single, calculated alliance. Tae-sung reached out, his finger tracing her jaw in a touch that was surprisingly gentle, yet felt like an act of possession. The exit strategy had begun, and Zariah understood that she had just traded her invisibility for a life that was far more terrifying. The tires of the black sedan hissed against the rain-slicked pavement of Seoul as the city's glittering skyline blurred into streaks of neon. Inside the car, the silence was calculated and heavy. Zariah sat pressed against the leather seat, her hand resting protectively on her belly, as she watched Park Tae-sung through the corner of her eye. He didn't look at her. His intense and controlled gaze was fixed on the road ahead, his broad shoulders filling the space with a quiet dominance that made the air feel thin. She was no longer the invisible maid in the Park estate. She was a witness, a prized acquisition being whisked away before the dangerous people she had warned him about could realize the deal had gone wrong. They arrived at an exclusive hotel, where the marble floors shone like ice. Tae-sung didn't lead her through the lobby. He guided her through a private entrance, his hand firm against the small of her back, a touch that felt less like affection and more like possession. 7. When the doors of the private hotel suite clicked shut behind them, the opulence of the room felt like chains. The suite was a gilded cage, filled with delicate white silk and expensive furniture that mocked Zaraya's vulnerability. "You'll stay here," Tae-sung said, his deep voice echoing in the sterile luxury of the room. He crossed the space in 3 strides, moving with the grace of a predator, and stopped inches from her. The smell of his expensive cologne mixed with the unspoken tension that had been building since the library. Zaraya lifted her chin, her steady gaze meeting his piercing eyes. "I can't stay here," she whispered, her voice serious, despite the trembling she couldn't quite hide. "I have a life. I have responsibilities." "Your life ended the moment you stepped out of the shadows," he countered, his hardened expression showing no remorse. He reached out, his finger tracing her jaw just as it had before, surprisingly gentle yet terrifyingly calculated. "You are under my protection now, Zaraya. In this city, that means you are claimed." She looked at the private suite, and then at the man who had turned her world into a shattered mirror. She was trapped in a foreign country, her passport likely already in his possession, and her only freedom was now tied to the Mafia boss, who looked at her as if she were the most terrifying thing he had ever encountered. The heavy silence of the hotel suite was thick with an unspoken tension that felt more suffocating than the gilded cage itself. Zaraya stood near the window, the glittering skyline of Seoul stretching out behind her like a sea of cold diamonds. She felt Park Tae-sung's intense gaze on her back, a calculated weight that tracked every breath she took. When she finally turned, she found him sitting on the edge of a velvet chair, his broad shoulders filling out his tailored black suit with a quiet dominance that commanded the entire room. He studied her with piercing eyes, looking past her Maid uniform to the strength and resolve she had shown at the docks. To Tae-sung, she was a paradox, a vulnerable woman carrying a child, yet the only person in his secretive world who had the composure to save his life. He watched the way her dark fingers rested protectively on her belly, a gesture of responsibility that seemed alien in his ruthless environment. "You are a strange woman, Zaraya," he said, his deep voice vibrating with a slight Korean accent. He stood and crossed the room with the grace of a predator, stopping close enough for her to see the subtle tattoo on his neck and smell his expensive cologne. The contrast between them was absolute. His steel versus her silk, his calculated violence versus her gentle defiance. Zaraya didn't pull away. Her steady gaze met his, refusing to be intimidated by his physical frame or his reputation in underground business circles. "I did what I had to do to survive," she replied, her voice serious and composed. Something flickered in his eyes. Not the amusement she had seen before, but a genuine approval of her spirit. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before his finger traced her jaw with a touch that was surprisingly gentle. In that moment, the unspoken tension shifted from fear to something terrifyingly intimate. He wasn't just studying a prized acquisition anymore. He was looking at the woman who had shattered his disciplined world. Zaraya felt a flutter in her stomach that she shouldn't have felt, a response to his proximity that her mind screamed at her to ignore. She was claimed, and as he looked at her with possession, she realized the steel of his world was now the only thing protecting her silk from the dangerous people outside. The air in the suite remained thick, a gilded cage, where the only sound was the steady thrum of the city outside. Zaraya stepped back, breaking the unspoken tension of Taesung's touch, and placed both hands firmly over her stomach. This was no longer about a maid and her boss. It was about the responsibility she carried for a life that hadn't even begun. Her steady gaze was serious, reflecting a resolve that even the most ruthless Mafia leader could not shake. "You say I am claimed," she began, her voice composed despite the vulnerability of her position. "You say your protection is the only thing keeping us alive. But I know how this world works, Taesung. Protection is just another word for a debt that never ends." She watched his intense and controlled expression, looking for any sign of the amusement he had shown before. He stood still, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the glittering skyline, listening with a quiet dominance that would have terrified a lesser woman. "I saved your life," she continued, her strength rising to meet his predatory presence. "I gave you the exit strategy you didn't even know you needed. In exchange, I don't want silk or gold. I want a guarantee." Taesung tilted his head, his piercing eyes narrowing as he studied his savior. "And what guarantee is worth the silence of a woman who knows my secrets?" he asked, his deep voice low and calculated. "Freedom," Zaraya replied, the word hanging in the air like steel. "Not for me but for my child. I want your word, a mafia boss's word, that when this illegal scheme is settled and the dangerous people are gone, my baby will never be a part of your world. No debts, no possession, no gilded cages. We walk away, and you forget the invisible maid ever existed." The unspoken tension returned, sharper than before. Taesung stepped closer, his disciplined frame looming over her, his calculated gaze searching her brown eyes for any hint of a liar. He saw only the emotional weight of a mother's love. For a man who viewed everything as a prized acquisition, the idea of letting something go was foreign. Yet, as he looked at her trembling fingers resting on her belly, a surprisingly gentle shift occurred in his hardened expression. He realized that her resolve was the only thing more dangerous than his own dominance. "You ask for the one thing I do not give, Zaraya," he whispered, his slight Korean accent brushing against her skin. "But for the woman who stopped the Korean Mafia cold, I will consider your solution." The unspoken tension in the room didn't break. It shifted into a calculated silence that signaled Park Taesung had made his choice. He turned away from the glittering skyline and walked toward a safe built into the mahogany wall, his broad shoulders blocking Zaraya's view as he retrieved a heavy black handgun. The sight of the weapon sent ice through her veins, but she didn't look away. Her steady gaze remained fixed on the man who was now her only protection in a world that had suddenly become ruthless and violent. "You want freedom for your child," Taesung said, his deep voice echoing against the cold marble of the private hotel suite. "But first you must survive the night. Kim Taewon does not like to lose, and he certainly does not like to be outsmarted by the invisible help." He checked the magazine with a disciplined click, a sound that underscored the dangerous reality they were now facing. He was a predator preparing for a hunt, and for the first time his strength was being used not to expand his empire, but to shield the woman who had saved him. Outside, the screech of tires punctuated the quiet of the exclusive floor. Taesung's intense and controlled expression hardened. He moved with the grace of a predator, crossing the room in 3 strides to reach Zaraya. He didn't pull her toward the door, instead he pushed her gently but firmly into a reinforced walk-in closet, his finger tracing her jaw one last time. "Stay low. Do not make a sound," he whispered, his slight Korean accent thick with a calculated promise of violence. As the heavy door clicked shut, Zaraya pressed her hand protectively on her belly, feeling the emotional weight of the predator's debt. Through the vents, she heard the shattered glass of the suite's main entrance and the ruthless shouts of men who had come to collect. Then came the sound of Taesung's quiet dominance, the rhythmic, disciplined thud of a man defending what he had claimed. He was no longer just a mafia boss protecting an asset. He was a man paying a blood debt to the vulnerable savior who had dared to stand in his way. Every shot fired was a testament to his resolve to keep the invisible Maid and her unborn child safe from the dangerous people who thought they could take what was his. The darkness of the reinforced closet felt like it was closing in, but Zariah refused to let terror take hold. Outside, the private hotel suite had become a battlefield of shattered glass and calculated violence. She could hear the heavy, disciplined thuds of Park Tae-sung engaging his ruthless rivals, his strength a barrier between her and elimination. She clutched her belly, her hand resting protectively, as a reminder of the responsibility that demanded she stay composed. Suddenly, the door to the closet was wrenched open. It wasn't Tae-sung. A man with a hardened expression and a lethal blade lunged toward her, his eyes filled with the intent of a predator. Zariah didn't scream. Instead, she found a resolve she didn't know she possessed. As he reached for her braided hair, she grabbed a heavy brass floor lamp from the corner of the small space. With a strength born of desperation, she swung the base, catching the attacker across the sharp jaw. The man stumbled back, his breath caught in surprise. Zariah didn't wait for him to recover. She used her steady gaze to find her exit strategy, dodging his reach and pushing a heavy marble pedestal into his path. She was vulnerable, but she was not harmless. Tae-sung appeared in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame as he took in the scene. His intense and controlled gaze flickered from the fallen attacker to Zariah, who stood with her chin lifted, forcing herself to meet his eyes even as her dark fingers trembled. There was a moment of unspoken tension, where amusement perhaps or approval flared in his piercing eyes. He stepped over the shattered remains of the furniture, moving with his usual grace, and stopped inches from her. "I told you to stay low," he said, his deep voice carrying a hint of irony. "I told you I wasn't just a maid," she replied, her heart hammering, but her resolve unbroken. In the secretive aftermath of the terrifying attack, the Mafia boss looked at his savior, and realized that the invisible woman he had claimed was a force of nature he could no longer ignore. The private hotel suite was silent once more, though the air remained heavy with the scent of expensive cologne, and the metallic tang of the terrifying struggle that had just ended. Park Tae-sung stood amidst the shattered wreckage, his tailored black suit slightly rumpled but his quiet dominance completely intact. He turned his intense and controlled gaze toward Zariah, who was still holding the brass lamp, her steady gaze reflecting a strength and resolve that had fundamentally altered the unspoken tension between them. He crossed the room with his usual predatory grace and gently took the heavy object from her trembling fingers. His touch was surprisingly gentle, yet it carried the weight of a calculated finality. "The maid died in that closet, Zariah," he said, his deep voice vibrating with a slight Korean accent. He reached out, his finger tracing her jaw as he forced her to look at him, his piercing eyes locking onto hers with a look of absolute possession. "You saved my life twice tonight," he continued, his hardened expression softening into something that felt like a dark angel's debt. "In my world, that makes you more than a witness. It makes you a prized responsibility." Zariah felt the emotional weight of his words settle over her like gilded chains. She was no longer invisible, and she was no longer just the help. By stopping the Korean Mafia cold with her warning, she had effectively claimed a place by his side that she could never vacate. He stepped closer, backing her against the window where the glittering skyline of Seoul watched them like 1,000 unblinking eyes. "Your freedom will come," he whispered, his broad shoulders shielding her from the ghosts of the dangerous people they had just defeated. "But for now, you and the child you carry are mine to protect. You are no longer a servant in a gilded cage. You are the only person I trust in a world that wants me dead." Zariah looked at the subtle tattoo on his neck and then at his intense eyes, realizing that her transformation was complete. She had started the night as a vulnerable woman trying to survive, and she was ending it as the most precious asset of a man who owned the city. As Taesung pressed a calculated kiss to her forehead, not out of affection but as a seal of his dominance, she understood that her life in the shadows was over. She was claimed, and in the secretive world of the Mafia, that was the most terrifying and secure place to be.